We're here in Shenzhen.
Yes.
So tell me what we're doing in a hotel room in Shenzhen right now.
So I'm on tour at the moment with School of Rock. It's the Australian production, but we're actually touring through China at the moment. So this is our fifth city. It's all kind of a bit of a blur now. It's early and it's a bit of a blur because we're at the moment our cities we're doing are a week at a time, so it's kind of hard to keep track of where we're up to. And we have 2 more cities after this to go, and then we complete our China tour, and then we'll go back to Australia and continue with our Australian tour.
And what's your role on the show?
I'm the deputy stage manager. So we're a stage management team of 3, a stage manager, a deputy, and an ASM. And in the music theatre world, the deputy stage manager is the primary show caller. So I teched the show in originally in Melbourne, and I take it in each city, and then I do the majority of the show calling for the week. But both other stage managers call. We all run the deck plot as well. But I generally, if we're doing 8 shows, I kind of call like at least half of those shows.
And how big's the team?
Of like stage management, it's 3 people here in China. In Australia, we would normally have a local as well who would come in to be our swing, to kind of rotate us out or cover us a little bit. But in China, that's a little bit more difficult. So it's just 3 here in China.
Awesome. So I want to talk a little bit about your history as a stage manager and what you got into and all that sort of stuff. So why stage management?
It's a funny thing, actually. I think naturally I kind of have always been a stage manager, even since like a small child. I was like always the one like organising the kids' parties and organising all the other kids. I did a lot of drama as a child, and I was definitely not gifted in that way, but I knew where everyone else was meant to be standing on the stage at all times and what props that they were meant to be carrying and always telling them when they were meant to enter and exit. So I was kind of naturally, I think, stage managing as a kid. And then I didn't really realise for a while that it was something that you could do as a career. And I kind of was thinking more along the lines of like teaching or something like that was more safe, and then hoping to kind of maybe get into stage management later on, and then I realised that was silly, and I didn't like teaching, and so I looked into doing stage management. So I actually went into stage to study a little bit older, so I was already I think I was 21, 22 by the time I went to university to study stage management.
And where did you study?
I studied at NIDA, the National Institute of Dramatic Art in Sydney. And initially, when I first went there, all I wanted to do was be a stage manager. And then about halfway through, I changed my mind and decided I really loved lighting, and I really loved lighting programming. And that was kind of more the direction I was heading. And even in my final year, all of my internships were in lighting, except one, which was in stage management at the House of Dancing Water. And then I kind of had a point in my life where I had to choose one or the other, and I ended up choosing stage management, which was the best decision. But I kind of had this period where I was doing both and had to kind of pick which route I wanted to go down. So here I am in China.
So no regrets for not doing lighting?
No. I think it's definitely 2 very different worlds, and I was kind of lucky when I was at NIDA that there was a period of time where all of the theatres were in a big upgrading process in terms of lighting. They were sort of getting new consoles and getting new moving lights and all that kind of thing. And I was fortunate to kind of be learning at that time and sort of became valuable in lighting as a programmer because I'd learnt on consoles that not a lot of people had the chance to learn on yet. But ultimately, I think I find much more joy in stage management, and it's afforded me like amazing opportunities throughout the world. I think my life would be very different if I was in lighting, but I definitely feel I've had a great life, and I don't regret my choices in any way. And I think ultimately I went the way that I was supposed to go.
Mm-hmm. And so, what was your first job? As a stage manager?
As a stage manager, my first job was at the House of Dancing Water. I had done an internship there the previous year, and I was actually living in New York, and I was working in lighting. And I had always kind of said that if there was a job opportunity that came up, like, to keep me in mind. And I don't know why, I just kind of had this, I was happy in New York and I was doing my lighting thing, and then I was like, oh, I should just email Anna and just remind her that if a job comes up that I am still interested. And then I did email you, and then like 3 weeks later you were like, oh, actually there is a job and we need you to start like now. And I was like, oh, okay, great. Now I have to decide like what I want to do with my life. So I think from sending the email to being in Macau, it was like, I don't know, 5 weeks or something.
No
like,
pressure.
something like that. So I started House officially in March 2013. As one of the assistant stage managers.
And what was it like moving to Macau? I mean, you'd obviously been in New York, you'd come from Australia.
Yeah.
And then you've moved to essentially China. What was that from a adaptation point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky because I had at least on the internship there, so I kind of had a perspective of where I was going to, because I'd been in Macau for 4 weeks, only 6 months earlier. And but especially like it's very different to being in like Australia or even the US, like culturally very different. Obviously there's huge language barriers, there's quite large cultural differences. In some ways I was a lot closer to home, but still felt like just as far away. So that was like it took me a while to adjust to Macau and Macau life. And like the Chinese culture in general. And I don't think I ever, like, especially with the language, I'm not very good at other languages. So that was something that I always struggled with, and I always tried to get better. But my basic understanding of Chinese after living there that long never really got that much better. But yeah, it was definitely a challenge, and especially coming into this massive show. Lots of different cultures within the show itself as well. Lots of different languages and cultural traditions, within the show. So it was kind of overwhelming to start off with, but like hugely exciting at the same time. And I think it took me a little while, but then I kind of like found my feet after that.
Do you think that sort of show is the right fit for all sort of stage managers, or do you think you have to really want to dive into that circus realm to be competent at it, I guess?
Yeah, like definitely not. I think having worked with a lot of different stage managers and having like a lot of them see the show or see footage of the show, it's definitely not for everyone. There's such a high level of risk for the performers, and therefore like a high level of risk for stage management, and a high level of training in regards to like emergency response, and the pressure of being not just being the show caller, but just even being a backstage stage manager on a show like that. There's a constant pressure that something's going to go wrong, and you're going to have to be a primary responder in someone being like severely injured, and someone who's most likely your friend as well. So I don't think that kind of pressure is necessarily for everyone. And also like a lot of people, they don't want to necessarily live overseas in that kind of way as well. So they want to be, they're happy to tour, but they want to tour in Australia, or they want to tour in America. So it's definitely a different world. I'm working in musical theatre now, touring in Australia, and it's a very different world to circus. So I don't necessarily think it's the right fit for everyone. But not any part of stage management is, I really think.
Yeah. What do you think are the personal attributes or skills that you need to sort of launch yourself from from where you come from in your hometown and where you've trained to an international stage management realm? Like, what is it that you need to have?
Yeah. I think the biggest thing is adaptability. I think that was at House especially, the people who weren't necessarily successful as stage managers, it was because they came with a certain idea of what stage management was and what the show was and what their role within it was, and you kind of need to throw that out the window like as soon as you get there, because it can be anything and everything, and you have to be adaptable to that, and also have no ego about it, I think, as well. You know, your job that day might literally be picking wet towels off the floor, and some people would look at that and go, well, you know, I've done so long in my career, so I don't want to be the person picking the towels off the floor. Believe me, no one wants to be the person picking the towels off the floor, but if that's what's required to keep people safe on my show and I'm one of the stage managers, then that's what you have to do. So I think you have to come with a certain flexibility and adaptability to go, this job could be anything and everything. I also think communication is a big one on any show, really, to work as a team. And then, you know, one of stage management's primary roles is to communicate with the rest of the members of the production, whether that be cast or crew. And so that you really do need to have a high level of being able to communicate with other people in a professional yet courteous way. So I think they're kind of my two biggest attributes. But definitely on shows like that as well, you're going to be working in big teams. So being able to be a team player is also a big one, because those, you know, a show can't be made on one person alone. So if you don't have the ability to function within a team setting, then that's going to become problematic, because you may be the show caller one show, but then the next show you might be on a track, and you need to let the person who is the show caller of that show make the decisions that are going to work best for the show that day. So I think they're like kind of the principal ones of well, not just this industry, but like not just circus, but stage management in general is. But I think especially on shows like that, it's not coming with any kind of preconceived ideas of what it's going to be, and being prepared to just go all in on whatever it does end up being.
So you have also worked at Le Rev in Las Vegas.
Yes.
All of the La shows.
Yeah.
And how much then, you know, you say that in stage management in the house you were doing everything from laying towels to calling the show, I guess. So there's a huge gamut. How much do you think was that an influence of the person, obviously I'm talking about myself, but like the person who made it, the show as a PSM, how much do you think that shaped the way that stage management run compared to, say, what you experienced in Le Rev? Not that you were involved in the creation of either, but do you think that the production stage manager has the ability to shape how a stage management team fits into a show?
Yeah, I think it sometimes depends on the company and how well established the company is as to how much influence the production stage manager has. I definitely think like if they have free reign of how they want the department and stage management in that show to operate, to work, then they can shape. It definitely is shaped by the PSM. I think in more established companies, the amount of flexibility that you have to shape is more limited, because there's more of a set way of how things are done.
Structure.
So like if a company's been established for a long time, you know, there's a defined idea of what the PSM is doing and what the show is going to do, because it needs to fit within the structure of how the rest of that company works. And that was one of the things actually that appealed to me about House, was that it was a new show and it was a relatively new company in a way, because of the way that Dragone shows work and how they're partnered. They tend to, you know, they take influence from the other Dragone shows, but then they kind of establish themselves in their own right. And that was something that appealed to me as a stage manager, was being a part of that process. And being able to help shape the way that things were done, rather than kind of being more of a cog in a, you know, in a wheel that's already been in motion for a very long time and knows exactly how it's operating. You know, there's definitely challenges that come from being in a kind of production that is still evolving, but then there's also you have a lot of flexibility in helping to shape that process. But definitely in new productions and new creations and newer companies, I think the PSM has a massive influence on how things are run, and you can see that on House from from knowing your background, you can see how that has helped shaped the way that it's structured, just in the same way that Le Rêve, a lot of the people that work on Le Rêve came off a New Day, and the way that Le Rêve is structured in a lot of ways is similar to how a New Day was structured, in terms of how it works, like operationally is even though Le Rêve and House are very similar shows, the way that they work is quite different in many ways.
And so in both of those sort of realms, in sort of Le Rêve and the House, and let's sort of stick with the circus realm right now. Traditionally, there's kind of a production team or a production team of stage managers that make a show, and then those who operate the show. What's your opinion on the ability for operational stage managers to be in that production realm, the people in production to be in operation realm, or should they go from one to the other and not leave the show once it's been made? Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one. I think a lot of the time it kind of depends on the person. I think there's definitely people who traditionally are on the production side for a reason, which is that they like to set up the show and then they like to leave and move on. So I think if it's a case of they're having to stay because they have to stay, I don't think it's necessarily going to be successful, because generally production people are there for that period of time. They like the short contracts. They like that they're just in a city for a period of time or a country, and then they get to like move on and do something else. Just in the same way, people who are more on the operational side, a lot of the time they're there for the long haul and they want to be there to see the project through. So I think people can definitely do both, but then they have to be in the mindset that that's kind of what they're coming to do. I think if you have production people who do want to help create the show and then do want to stay long term, then that can be very beneficial for the show, because they were there to help create and start the process, and then they can kind of continue that through. But I think they have to come in already with that mindset, because if they're feeling more like they're stuck there, then that can then actually be to the detriment of the show, because if they don't want to be there, then it's not ideal. But I think people tend to mostly head towards one or the other, because that's where they find their joy of what they like in stage management. So it's not to say that people can't do the crossover, but people tend to be in the field that they like. And there are people who have done both and it's been successful, but I think people tend to generally kind of be one or the other. Yeah.
So back to you for a little bit. Do you feel, it's probably a bad time to ask this question, being in the middle of Shenzhen after 5 weeks already, do you feel you have a good work-life balance?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's very difficult right now because, as you said, I'm in China right now, and literally it's just work. Australia is different, because I've found, like, especially being back in the musical theatre world, my hours are a lot better than when I was in circus. So I have the ability to have more of a work-life balance. Whereas in circus it was definitely more difficult. But it's also always hard to pinpoint, because I've either always been in another country or on tour, or like, so finding that balance is always been something that I've struggled with, and something that I kind of make a conscious effort to work on. I also love to work, so I have to make a very conscious decision to, limit myself and my hours, and because I can just be working all the time. The good thing with musicals is kind of, once they're up and running and once your covers are rehearsed in, then the show is generally fairly stable, so you don't have to kind of put in the mammoth hours that you do in circus, where there's constant turn through of cast, there's constant issues with technical, just because the shows are so heavily technical. So you're doing these hours like all of the time. A cast change for for musical theatre takes about 30 minutes, whereas a lineup for circus takes, up to 2 to 3 hours, depending on the show. So I definitely have a better ability to have a work-life balance than I've had in the past. But I think it's also something as stage managers that you need to make a conscious effort to work on, because we generally are kind of bit of workaholics, so you kind of have to make that conscious decision to be like, okay, like I'm going home now, I'm not going to look at my emails, I'm not going to look at, deal with these problems tomorrow, and actually like switch off or, see friends or see family and not be thinking about work all the time. So it's a constant flux of trying to find that balance. I think, as I said, like right now it's kind of non-existent, especially on tour overseas. You kind of end up being a little bit more involved all the time with what's going on. But once I get back to Australia, then it definitely will go back more to having more of a life side, and the work side will go down as well.
Good. What's the best advice you've been given about working in the industry from anyone? Do you have that?
That's an interesting question. That's a hard one, actually, because I feel like I've been given like great advice a lot of the time. I've had like great mentors across the industry. I think probably one of the best things is about, maintaining that work-life balance and not letting this job be all-consuming, which it can so easily be. I think for me, it really took leaving house to kind of realise that, because I definitely at house, it was everything, but it's just so easy to get burnt out. So I think it's about looking after yourself while you also look after everyone else, because ultimately if you can't look after yourself and you can't keep care of yourself, then it's going to be difficult for you to be a very effective stage manager and look after other people. So probably a few years ago I would have said something different, but now as I get older I realise how important it is to maintain your own like mental health and your own emotional health and look after yourself, first and foremost, before letting everyone else kind of take over from that. So having that maintaining your relationships with people outside of the industry, with your family, looking after yourself physically and emotionally as well is only going to make you a better stage manager. But it takes a while to learn those things.
Yeah, the tendency is to go balls to the wall to begin with, right?
Yeah.
And then trying to prove yourself.
Yeah.
And be competitive as being an employed person in the industry. I think when it comes to like the skill set of being a stage manager, it's a kind of a two-part question. And I guess this probably centres around the more high-pressure stuff of the circus realm. How do you think it's best to scale as a show caller to that level, for one? And then how does one become adept at dealing with situations under pressure as a stage manager? Do you think that there's a path to improving that from an individual point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I have quite a unique story because, I mean, the first show professionally that I ever called was House. So that's a big, in some ways that, from looking at the outside, that, that seems ridiculous. But I, by the time I was calling the show, I'd been there like 2.5 years. And so in that sense, it seems more natural because it's like, you've had the opportunity to be around and listen to the show. I'd listened to the show be called thousands and thousands of times. And, then there's a process of training to get to the point where you're actually show calling. I think in circus, the way that rehearsals and trainings are structured, they so often need show callers to be involved. And the good thing is when you're calling like trainings, especially for like aerial acts, they're going to be in segments. So you're calling like bits of cues at a time. So then you get a true understanding of like when you're calling a cue, what that cue is actually made up of and how it's actually structured. So I think through that process of coming up through the ranks, you kind of learn these skills to the point that then you actually can be trained to call the show. So starting from very basic trainings, understanding the processes of the basic operating process of running basic trainings of like how to, on a show like House, it's, how to drop the lift safely. There's a set of processes to be able to do that of, what you need to ask for, what you're going to get responded to on comms, what you need to announce to people in the house, what clears you need from what departments, so even something as very basic as dropping lifts, there's going to be a step-by-step process of how to do that. So doing those kind of trainings at a basic level and then building up to the more difficult aerial trainings to eventually being able to call full act sequences, and then eventually the whole show. There's a process of how you kind of build up to that point. And so that's kind of, I guess, like in those kind of shows, that's the best way to kind of like scale up. It also depends on the show too, because shows like House, there's not necessarily the need for, it's a big team, so there's not a need for everyone to be a show caller, but there's a need for the majority of the team to have basic show calling to be able to run all the trainings and rehearsals that need to happen. Whereas at Larev, all stage managers, and it's a smaller team, so anyone who's of a stage management level or above has to be a show caller, and has to be calling within a certain period of time to kind of basically to get through your probation. You kind of have to be show calling within a certain period. So they're already looking for people who have that show calling ability that they want, Mm-hmm. Not everyone, not every show is prepared to help upskill people, basically, or nor do they need to. And I think in terms of, to the other question, in terms of learning how to deal with situations under pressure, I don't really know how you can train for that as much as you want in an offline setting, in emergency, scenarios or that kind of thing. But really, until it happens to you and you're under that pressure yourself, you never truly know how you're going to respond. So all you can do is wait and kind of deal with it at the time and then learn from it. I mean, I definitely, especially in my early days of show calling, made decisions that weren't necessarily the best decisions, and it's only from looking at it afterwards with a critical eye that you can go, okay, well, if that was to happen again, I would do A, B, and C instead. And even now, like anytime there's any sort of like show stop or problem, I always look at it afterwards and go, okay, what could I have done better or faster or responded sooner or seen something different. So I feel that the important thing with those situations is always to look at it retrospectively and go, how could I be better the next time? I think assuming that you know how it all works and how you're going to handle everything is not realistic, and it's not a safe way to be as a stage manager, because I think you should always feel like, yes, you should have the basic idea of what you're going to say and what your processes are as a show or as a team. But ultimately, you always need to be looking at it and then trying to make it better each time. Because I think going, oh no, we have a process and that's the process and it's always going to work is not realistic,
So you've been quite successful in getting work from New York to Las Vegas to Macau and back in Australia. Aside from the path where we know how you got to house, how are you getting work? What's your method of landing work across the world?
Yeah. I think I was initially when I was in Vegas after Macau, and I kind of had this, I just kind of really wanted to go home, like for a while. I wanted to go back to Australia, and one of my friends was like, well, just come back for a year, just come back to Australia. And I mean, it was really scary actually, because I've never worked professionally in Australia, so I have connections with the people that I kind of went to university with, and a few other people that I've met through them, but I don't really didn't anyway have a big network in Australia. So all I could kind of do is like email some of the companies that I know and say, look, I'm coming back to Australia. Do you have kind of any work opportunities? And I was lucky that I was offered, most of the time. Also, by the time I kind of emailed, most companies had kind of filled their bill for the next year. There were a couple of spots that were open, and so I ended up. I kind of had two opportunities. I could have gone into like straight theatre or into musicals that kind of got the opportunities, at the same time. And, I chose to kind of go the musical side because generally musicals are, especially in Australia, are longer running and they're touring, whereas most straight theatre is generally sit down in whatever city it's being created. And it was also a financial thing of, touring is much more lucrative when it comes to, earning some money and, not having expenses and not having to, I've been fortunate, I've been on tour now for a year, so I haven't had to yet rent an apartment in Australia or deal with any of those kind of financial costs. So it's been really great in that way to help me like save some money. And then it's kind of, our industry is very based on network and based on the context that you make. And I've kind of just jumped from one show to the next show through the contacts that I made on the first show. I started on a musical in Australia and made contacts there. And then, I got a short-term contract on another musical based on the fact that someone had recommended me from the musical that I'd just previously worked on. And then School of Rock was the same thing. I had been recommended for the job based on my contacts through that way. There's also seems to be a shortage of calling stage managers in Australia at the moment that kind of sit at the middle level. And so I've actually been offered quite a lot of work because I have that calling ability. And because I haven't come from the musical theatre world, I didn't feel the need to kind of come in at the head stage management level. I was happy to come in as a calling stage manager and kind of learn more about this side of the industry, which I knew really nothing about. So there seems to be a lot of ASMs and then a lot of stage managers, but not a lot of deputy stage managers. So kind of like filled a little like sweet spot in the middle. So I've actually had some other job offers in Australia in musicals as well, that obviously I can't take because I'm on this show. But it seems to have been a good time for me to go back to Australia for this period. But ultimately, I think that our whole industry is based on contacts and people that you know, and how you hold yourself and how you operate. One of my biggest things, which I try to think that I do relatively successfully, is to try and always be kind to people. And, sometimes, especially during techs and stressful times, that's less or more difficult. But I feel like that if you operate yourself in a kind way to people, then you're also more likely to get recommended or to get work. Obviously, you also have to be, people have to see that you have a skill set and ability that they are happy to recommend you. But, you know, I know lots of people in the industry who I think are like incredibly talented, but not necessarily the nicest people to work with or work for. So I think it's a combination of having a great skill set and also being a great human, or at least trying to be a great human. And then people who you're connected with, you know, will naturally recommend you for shows based on those things.
Sure. No, that's good. Do you think, across the board, from when you've started working professionally as a stage manager, that you've been paid enough?
Ooh, that's a hard one. Yes and no. I think when we were in Macau, we earned fairly decent money, you know. But I feel like also it's a hard one to like quantify, because I feel like when you're on tour or when you're living overseas, you earn decent money, but you also give up a lot. And I don't know if the money necessarily compensates for the things that you give up. So it's easy to save and make money at the time, but you're kind of sacrificing other things to be able to do that. I feel like I've constantly had to battle to prove my value. You know, I know when I was moving up in-house to new roles, it was a constant struggle with people in the HR side who don't necessarily understand the industry, even though they're the HR for the industry. They don't necessarily understand what a stage manager is or what a stage manager's value is, or the difference between what your responsibilities are from level to level. So I feel like I've constantly had to prove what I'm worth, and constantly had to battle, and that's still an ongoing thing. You know, in musical theatre, you are constantly contract negotiating with new producers, and it's difficult because you get an offer that you're, you know, often is less than what you're expecting or what you're willing to work for, and then there's a process of having to negotiate, oftentimes directly with the producer, who's then going to be your boss, or, you know, for that contract. So it's a hard struggle between pushing for what you're worth and you know, trying to also keep the, you know, especially if you do want to work for them, actually keep the job, but also you then have to create a relationship with these people. So it's like, it's a difficult thing because you're excuse me, you have to prove your value and fight for yourself, but also it's direct. It's not like an actor where you have an agent or someone to advocate on your behalf, or, you know, a lot of times the technical crew will go through the technical manager or the technical director through to the producers, where stage management, a lot of time it's like direct with the producers, so that can be a difficult thing. I also feel like these days, as you get older too, you understand more of your value and what you're worth, and you're less scared about not getting work. So there is a fight to, you know, you're not as scared to fight for what you're worth. Whereas I feel like when you're younger and you're starting up in the industry, you kind of happy to take any work. And I feel like people often take advantage of that. I've seen, especially in Australia at the moment, the pay rates are going down instead of going up, because they're just hiring less and less experience, and they're hiring people who are happy to take like less and less money. And because the cost of putting on a musical, especially touring in Australia, are ginormous. But there's kind of this thing of like, oh, well, you're going to be getting, you know, you're going to be getting a living allowance on top of that, and you're going to be getting potentially a rental allowance on top of that. It's like, yeah, but those don't substitute for income. They're a separate allowance, because I am on tour for the next year and I'm not going to be at home. So I'm entitled to that money, but it's not like, oh, well, you're getting that money as well, so that on top of your salary. It's like, yeah, that's not how it works, you know? So I definitely, I feel like you have to come to some sort of decision as to whether what you're happy to accept. But I don't think it always, I don't think we're necessarily always paid our true value. And I don't think we're necessarily honest about the true hours that we work as well. Is the other big thing is that, you know, if you're in a tech week and you're doing 14-hour days, you'll put down 2-hour breaks, you know. But no stage manager's taking 2 hours off in the middle of the day, you know, between tech sessions to like go out of the building, you know, and even if they are going out of the building, it's like to run and get lunch and they're probably still doing emails and they're like, you know, if you're working a 14-hour day as a stage manager, then you've worked 14 hours that day. You've probably worked more because you've actually come in like half an hour to 45 minutes early, but you just put the time that you were supposed to start, and then you've probably gone home and done another 2 hours at work at home on top of that, you know. So let's be real, none of us are working the hours that we say we are on our timesheet most of the time. Yeah, you know, like I don't know many people, you know, obviously it depends on the industry, but you know, most people aren't, especially like in corporate world, like if they're getting an hour break, then they're going for a break for an hour. Like they're going out of the building, they're going to get their lunch, and then they're going to come back and do work when they get back in. Whereas that doesn't really work for us. I also, you know, like standard, you know, working hours are 38 hours a week or something in the normal world. I mean, whenever, you know, you're like, oh, it's a good week because I only did 50 hours this week, you know, instead of 70, you know. So I kind of feel what we place on ourselves as an expectations of the hours that we're going to work is totally different. You know, like if you ever work like a 40-hour week, you feel like you haven't really done anything and you kind of feel like you're taking advantage, which is ridiculous because that's an actual working week.
It's a normal week.
That's just a normal week. Whereas like we're like, oh, well, you know, 50, that's pretty good for this week, you know.
And it's hard too because then the producers have got a responsibility on their own to make the show profitable and,
to
and
keep
affordable,
it,
and,
you know, to maintain it and keep it running, because that's the other thing. It's like you want that show to keep running because that's your employment, you know. So it's a fine balance. You know, the other thing in our industry is like, especially once you're outside the circus world, you traditionally are only getting 1 day off a week, you know. So it's like, yeah, you might be doing like 45, 50 hours, but it's spread over 6 days. And so there's also a toll that takes, you know, that you're only truly guaranteed 1 day off a week. And, you know, that has a big effect on people. And generally in, you know, especially in music theatre, it's going to be a Monday. So that's difficult as well because, you know, the 2 biggest days of the week in music theatre are Saturday, Sunday and Friday nights. And that's traditionally when everything happens, you know, birthdays, weddings, you know, events, all those kind of family functions are on those days. So, you know, it's hard enough that even if you are in town or wherever your family happened to be at the time, it's going to be difficult to sometimes be able to go to those kind of things. The good thing with long running shows is that you generally either have enough people in-house in your team to cover you, or in Australia you'd have a swing. So then you can apply for those dispensation to go to have special events and those kind of things. And depending on the company and who you work for is the varying levels of how much they're okay or not okay with that. I find that the companies that are more successful and good at employing people long term are more lenient in those kind of ways because they understand that to truly keep people, you need to let them have that balance of being able to be at those, you know, at those events or functions. I've also realized as I get older that, you know, the more that you know in advance and the more that you can contractually pre-agree to is also a benefit. You know, I think like back when I was younger, it was like you just signed a contract and you would just hope that they would let you have the time off. And now it's like, well, yes, I can do this contract, but I need X, Y, and Z dates off for various reasons. And then, you know, but I think as you get older too, you know, you'll get work. So then you can kind of go, well, if this event is so important to you and they're not going to give it to you, then you don't take that contract, you know.
The thing is, though, I think with a lot of that negotiation and battling for contract to contract, do you think that hinders your ability to see long term in terms of establishing a retirement fund, planning for a family, thinking about where you'll be in 10 years, all of those things that a lot of people who are in I say normal jobs, different jobs, have time to contemplate, plan, think, and act accordingly. Do you think it kind of prevents you from thinking like that? And what's your sort of idea of how that trajectory of your life goes as you progress in your career?
I mean, it depends on your career and where you're kind of working. Like, I mean, if you're, you know, people on resident shows in Vegas, say, for example, are mostly there for the long term, and they're there because they've either done the touring thing and they want a family and they want that stability, but they still want to be in the industry, or they've been there since shows have opened and they've seen that if they keep working on these shows, then they can have that life balance that they want. It's just Vegas is a difficult place to get to that point if you're not already there. Like, if you've got the family and you've got the touring, you know, you've done your touring thing and you've already got your family established, then Vegas is a great place to live and be in the industry kind of a little bit further down in your career. I found it difficult because I was not at that point. You know, I didn't have a partner or family, so a lot of the great benefits of living in Vegas, they weren't the same for me. So I think you can do it if you're in those kind of instances, but those instances are rarer and rarer, you know, unless you're on a long-running show on Broadway or a long-running show on the West End or a resident show in Vegas. That's kind of it, you know. Most of the rest of our industry is either touring and it's freelance based. You know, there's not a lot of full-time jobs in our industry. I remember when I was leaving Vegas and leaving the Rev, and initially I was going to like a 6-month contract, and people were horrified for me that was what I was choosing, because for them they couldn't understand that I would give up this security and this full-time job. But yeah, it is difficult because you can kind of only really see through to one contract at a time. And, you know, until that show really opens as well and you see how it's doing, it's hard to know too how, you know, some people have been on shows that they thought would be successful and they've closed within 4 weeks, you know, so then that changes the whole trajectory of your life. I feel it's very difficult in Australia to maintain a career in this industry, especially as female, and have a family, because most of our industry is touring. And so how do you maintain a family, especially once they start to get older, and be on tour at the same time? You know, so I think it's easier if you're male, especially if your partner is you know, maybe not working, and then they can just tour with you and their kids. But even then, like, even if you're male, once your kids get to a certain age, you want them to have some sort of stability, so you want to put them into school, and so then it's going to become more difficult for you to continue to do the work that you're doing. I think that's one of the big reasons that so many people jumped at the opportunity of Harry Potter in Australia, because, you know, it's a sit-down show that's going to potentially be there for years. And that's never really happened in Australia before. So a lot of people were so keen to get on that show because it was in Melbourne, which is a great, you know, city, and it's quite affordable. And they didn't have to be on tour anymore. You know, I think a lot of people get burnt out of the touring because they do want a life, and they do want, you know, it's very difficult. If your partner's not in the industry, it's very difficult. If your partner is in the industry, then they're potentially not on the same show as you, so that's also very difficult. If you want to have kids, that's a whole other story. Maintaining, you know, I feel like most people in our industry have doing well at either investing in like real estate or like financially, because they know like long term everything's kind of in flux, so people will save money on. That's why people tour, so they can save money like crazy and like buy houses or invest in shares or whatever, so that they have some stability, because this industry is so not stable.
Well, one final question, because we're almost to an hour.
Of course.
As we do. We could go for 3 hours if we wanted to. What advice would you give to younger people trying to get into the industry as a stage manager? Mm-hmm. Either that it be in Australia or overseas or actually mostly let's talk about international, because a lot of people ask me, how do I get to work overseas and how do I do that? What would be your advice?
I think I think these days most people who are coming through stage management are coming through some sort of tertiary educational program. So I would say, like, when you are coming, when you're coming through those programs, they'll often have lots of guest, like, lecturers and stage managers who come in to talk. So, like, take the details and the contacts of all those people, like, because once you're in contact with one person, you're potentially in contact then with their entire network, especially if they like you. I do some guest teaching back at NIDA when I'm in Sydney, and I always give my email address. But it amazes me because, maybe one person out of 20 will email me. And, not to say that they don't maybe keep it and then they have me in the back of their mind for later on. But, like, if you want to work overseas, then I'm a great contact to have, or at least be able to know who to put you in contact with. So I think always, like, you've got to be aware of your network and creating a network for yourself and taking the details of these people and keeping them, making some sort of list that has all the stage managers and their email or their mobile numbers, so that you can kind of contact those people as you need them. And then I think sometimes you just have to, like, blind email people. A lot of my work that I initially got in New York was through blind emailing, and I mean, it's a lot easier now because there's so much more information online. But looking at the shows that you like and the people that you want to work with, and then finding the ways to contact them. Like, LinkedIn is a great one now. You can contact a lot of people through LinkedIn. I was just in New York a year ago, and it was just before I was already in talks to start on School of Rock, and School of Rock was still on Broadway at the time. So, I contacted the stage managers on that show through LinkedIn, kind of just saying who I was and that I was potentially going to be one of the stage managers for School of Rock Australia, and if there was any chance that I could either meet with them or come and see the show from backstage or whatever, and they were like, sure. And I got a great opportunity to see how the show worked and the show call worked from behind the scenes, just through an email that didn't cost me anything other than 10 minutes to research who they were and their names, which you can all find online, and then finding email addresses to contact them. So I think it's really important in our industry, especially if you want to work overseas, to, like, create that network for yourself and to keep the details of all these people that you meet or that you work with, who you might have contacts overseas as well.
Hustle.
Yeah, basically. If that's what you want. Like, I mean, I think it depends what you want. I think, like, if you're a good stage manager and you come out of university and you do the right internships in Australia, then you'll get work, because there's always work. So I think, like, if you want to be in music theatre in Australia, then you do your internships in music theatre, and then someone will, if you're not an idiot, then someone will give you a job as an ASM in music theatre in Australia, and then you're fine. But even in music theatre in Australia, you have to look at, like, who the producing companies are and what the shows are that are coming, and, like, who you want to work with. It's just a little bit easier, especially if you're at a tertiary education in Australia, because you're naturally kind of going to know more of what's going on, and your university is going to help you put you in touch with those people. But if you want to work for companies like Dragone or Cirque du Soleil, or if you want to work on Broadway or meet stage managers on Broadway, like, most universities in Australia aren't going to be able to help you to do that. You're going to have to do that yourself through your own research. And most people, like, if you reach out to them and you ask something simple like, can I come and observe the show call? I'm a student, I'm trying to learn. Then most people are going to be fine with it. And they'll respond to you, or they'll at least, like, if they can't let you backstage, then they might, people who've come up as stage managers generally want to help other stage managers, so they'll at least like maybe agree to meet you for a coffee and have a chat about their show and their career, which is also just as valuable, because then you have that person in your network now for the next time as well. So I think that's probably my biggest piece of advice, is to just really to maintain maintain some sort of contact book of all these people that you meet, but also that when you go out as an intern or out into the industry, that you represent yourself the way you want to be represented, because it's very easy to establish a reputation for yourself, either positive or negative, and I think people underestimate how much other people have a say in their employment. You never know when you're working with people who are the people that are going to be asked for a recommendation the next time you go to work on a job, because it's not just stage managers. I've had people ask me about casts that I've worked with and whether I would work with them again or recommend them. I've had them ask me about crew and other stage managers, and so you never know, like, someone that you may think very little of may be the person that gets asked as to whether you should be hired. So I think you always have to try and represent yourself, like, and be conscious of that, because it could be anyone who's asked for a recommendation of what you're like and who you are to work with. And if you treat people badly, then that's what your reputation will be, and then you'll be less likely to get work. So I think you always have to be aware of how you treat people, especially people below you, because you never know when those people below you might be the people above you, or might be the people who are asked to give a recommendation. So it's not just about treating the high management and the producers and those people nice. You kind of have to be kind and nice to everyone. So they're probably my two biggest ones.
Awesome. Super. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Rockstar.